What a fantastic talk. I just feel so incredibly motivated right now to just sign up somewhere online to volunteer. So Neil, you can unmute yourself and show your video if you like. So before we move into the Q&A session, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience members?
For sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Dogra. I'm a senior at the University School of Milwaukee right now. I'm actually in my last week of high school, which is exciting, but it feels weird. Next year, I'll be going to the University of Rochester, and I'll actually be spending 8 years there as part of a medical scholars program. So I'll be there for both undergrad and med school.
Exciting.
Oh, that's fantastic. We have a few questions prepared from our team that we will start off with. And remember, if you have a question for Neil, you can click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to type in your question. So our first question for you, Neil, I remember when we first received your application nearly 2 years ago, and Ava and I were just blown away by all of your incredible accomplishments. We were really thrilled to see your original application and learning how much you had already accomplished at such a young age. You were 17 when you applied. We just want to give you a moment. Are there any accomplishments or experiences that stand out that you'd like to share with our viewers, just to kind of give yourself a quick shout out?
I think one thing that I briefly mentioned in my talk, but wasn't so much the focus, has been my involvement with science research. So I actually started working in a college lab this summer after my 8th grade. But I think one thing that's really interesting is how my interests in research evolved over time and how they evolved based on what I was doing in the community. So when I started after 8th grade, I was working with the corrosion of different metals, and I was working in engineering, and I definitely enjoyed it. But as I started to volunteer more and more, I realized that my passion was in public health and neuroscience. And so that actually influenced where I spent my time in the lab. And I ended up by the end of high school doing research in addiction and anxiety treatment. So I think that's really interesting how your passions sort of develop and overlap as you go throughout high school.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that you mentioned in your TEDx talk is one way that you fought against the opioid crisis by presenting at public schools. So you did reference this in your talk, but do you want to get into it a little bit more about how your age, not being too much older than the students you were presenting for, what value or impact do you think that had for the students?
For sure. I think it really boils down to the fact that I get what it's like to be a kid and listen to these drug seminars. I've had my fair share of drug education, and frankly, it's not all that interesting because, as a 12, 13-year-old, it's really hard to imagine yourself encountering something like heroin. So it's not really, it feels like it's not worth your time, frankly. You want to zone out and you want to not pay attention because this doesn't feel particularly relevant to your day-to-day life. And I get that. And that's why I try to take a different approach. And I try to begin my presentations in a way that can hook my audience and make them empathize with the cause at hand. So one of the things that I really like to focus on is some familiar faces who have suffered from opioid addiction. And very often that's rappers and celebrities, even a couple athletes that people are familiar with. And then beyond that, I think, I get what it's like to be a kid. I get that these presentations can often feel very long. So I try to keep things very concise. I try to keep all my presentations under 15 minutes and make the bulk of my time there Q&A so that these kids can really get to what they're interested in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It sounds like a really valuable experience for them. So I know that many institutions already incorporate this, but what are your thoughts on school systems, either at high schools or colleges, incorporating more extensive volunteering programs into their curriculum? And kind of a double question, how can schools encourage students to see it as more than a simple hour requirement?
I'm all for it. I think that there's so much value in service-driven learning. I mentioned earlier that my community service influenced my passions in the laboratory, and I think that's very true for a lot of people. So as far as service hour requirements go, I think absolutely. I think every high school should have them in place because I think for me, without that 20-hour requirement, there's a chance I never would have ended up doing any of this, which is pretty frightening to think about. I'm really glad that all of this happened the way it did. I think one word of caution or advice would be don't restrict your students in how they serve. So give them the independence to explore their passions as they develop. Give them the independence to volunteer in maybe a not traditional way. You don't have to be too restrictive in how you define community service, because as my films can show, it can take a fairly unconventional route, and you can still be serving your community all the while.
Absolutely, completely agree. So I want to get into your documentary, Crescent of Hope, a little bit more. Is there anything you want to share about that experience? And then also, where can our attendees access that documentary?
So the documentary is free to view on YouTube. If you just search up my name and Crescent of Hope, it should be pretty easy to find. I really do think that making that documentary changed my life. It certainly changed my perception of Milwaukee. I've grown up in a suburb in a more affluent area, and I really had no idea that the refugee crisis was something happening, miles from my home. I always thought that this was an overseas problem happening in maybe more underdeveloped or war-riddled countries, and I had no idea that its effects are so extensive. I also didn't realize that being a refugee doesn't end when you actually flee your country. I think in many ways it begins when you flee your country. Refugees in Milwaukee face an appalling lack of financial and social support. They're often thrown into this really convoluted healthcare system, and they hardly speak English, and now they're expected to overcome both the physical and mental stress of being a refugee while having very basic health insurance and a very minimal understanding of how our healthcare system works. So that's one thing that I started to realize more and more as I was filming this documentary, and that actually became the subject of my second documentary.
Mm. Wow. I'm looking in the Q&A and I'm not seeing any questions from our audience members yet. Remember, you can ask your questions for Neil in the Q&A tab. So I'll move on to another question from our team. So you mentioned in your talk that some of the kids from the Crescent Learning Center, you thought of them as lifelong friends. And just out of curiosity, have you been able to stay in contact with some of the kids that you worked with?
It's been tough. It's been really tough because of the COVID protocols. I did get the chance to visit them at least once over the summer, and then I've been working closely with one particular family as they've kind of fought their way through this changing landscape financially and socially. I really do miss seeing them every day of my summer. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible this past summer, but I'm hoping we can get together for some basketball soon.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It looks like we might have something that popped up in the Q&A. Oh, awesome. From Jesse Franklin. What do you see yourself doing 10 years from now?
10 years from now, I would be
just about graduating, so.
Yeah, so I'd be like 2 years out of med school. Gosh, I don't really know exactly where I would end up. It's a tough question. I really can't see that far ahead. I know for sure that I'll be doing something with public health. I don't know what exactly that'll look like. So maybe I'll be starting my residency and going straight into the most effective path to becoming a practicing physician, or maybe I'll take some time off and do some community service and use that as part of my medical education. I definitely want to get involved with global service as well. Like I said, the refugee crisis is extensive, and it's playing out over here in Milwaukee, but it's also playing out across the globe. So I'd love to fight it on that front and provide some public health in that aspect.
Awesome. We have a couple more questions in the chat for you. So this person, Montserrat asks, what has been your biggest takeaway from this experience? I think they mean about the TEDx experience.
I would say the resiliency that goes into something like this. I just want to give a huge thank you to the TEDx UWM team for persevering through a pandemic and still putting on such an amazing event. As you've mentioned, it's been almost 2 years in the making, and it's felt pretty scary at times. I didn't know if it was going to happen, but I think ultimately the fact that a team can work together and put something on that's so effective has been very inspiring to me.
Oh, well, thanks for the shout out. We appreciate it. One more question from our audience here. Are you working on any more documentary films? And I'll add to this, if you aren't right now, do you plan to explore that more in the future?
For sure. Yeah, I'm not working on anything right now. I'm just wrapping up my senior year right now. I'd like to take some time to sort of explore the basics of filmmaking. I'm self-taught completely. And so thus far, I've been pretty minimalistic in terms of the equipment and the editing softwares I'd use. So I'd love to explore that a little more, take some classes in college, and hopefully work with a team on my future documentaries, because so far it's just been me.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. Awesome. So it looks like that is it for our audience Q&A. I know one of our team members did put a link for the Youth Summit on Opioid Awareness and the YouTube link for the Crescent of Hope documentary in the chat, so our audience can check it out there. Neil, are there any other resources, links, social media handles, or just messages you'd like to leave our audience with?
I'll go for that last one. I'll just give a brief message and say, please do consider starting your own journey with personalized altruism, and please consider volunteering even as early as this weekend.